Reports that Saudi Arabia may be willing to rein in crude production if Iran does the same are buoying hopes of a deal to cut output at next week's OPEC meeting. Sharalee reports.
Oil prices might be about to get a boost. Ministers from the OPEC cartel of producer nations meeting in Algeria next week. Russia will be there too, and there's growing talk of a deal to cut production to boost prices.
The reason why we, and actually sources are telling us, believe that chances are increasing is simply because most producers, including Saudi Arabia, the biggest producer in OPEC, and Iraq and Iran and non-OPEC Russia, they've all pretty much reached the peak production capacity. So it's very difficult for them to push output any further. And hence the situation for a compromise is slightly better than, let's say, a few months ago.
But oil market veterans aren't holding their breath. OPEC often discusses production cuts and rarely delivers. Even when it agrees a deal, members have a habit of reneging. Domestic politics could also get in the way.
An oil minister cannot travel back to his home country and report to his government that he cut a deal that will be perceived as a weak deal at home. So he needs to present it as some sort of a victory.
Iran may hold the key. It's only just returned to international markets after sanctions were lifted. Tehran has been busy ramping up output, not cutting it. Now Reuters sources say Saudi Arabia might cut production if Iran will at least stop increasing. But both sides will need a deal that makes them look like the victor.
EU ministers move towards approving a free trade deal with Canada, but opposition towards a similar agreement with the U.S. appears to be growing at grassroots level and among some European leaders. Sharalee is back with this report.
Trade ministers meeting in Bratislava. The smiles are on, but it's been a somewhat strained week for TTIP and other trade talks. Marred by protests, no deal is expected before the end of US President Obama's time in office.
It makes sense to continue the talks and negotiations. There is a round planned for beginning of October in New York, and we will try to make as much progress there as possible.
France and Austria want fresh talks started under a new name, and even Germany is holding out little hope of a breakthrough.
I think a lot are very, very unhappy about the secretive nature of these negotiations, a feeling that they're giving companies, supranationals, far too much power, and of course there are what seem to be some intractable issues, such as the penetration of genetically modified foods within the European marketplace, which would seek to be bundled within this agreement.
Washington and Brussels had been keen to seal the deal before Obama leaves. With elections on both sides of the Atlantic and Britain's vote to leave the EU all potential stumbling blocks.
Europe, for obvious reasons, would like to see a trade deal get inked, at least in principle. It would boost growth, and as I mentioned earlier on, growth is increasingly hard to come by in this world. But the political costs associated with that might be very high indeed, and they've really pushed the onus back onto the US to make concessions.
One glimmer of hope, though, a trade agreement with Canada remains on track.